Hi everyone, my name is Nir Goldstein, Managing Director of GFI Israel. Thank you for joining us for today's session about the Israeli State of Alternative Protein Innovation webinar. In this webinar, Aviv Oren, our Director of Business Engagement and Innovation, and myself will discuss with you the most interesting angles of our recently published report. So I'd like to begin with a few words about the Israeli ecosystem. But first, before we dive in, if you need some background about alternative protein or GFI, please visit our website or YouTube channel. And yeah, let's begin with how Israel has developed itself as an alternative protein powerhouse, which it has in the past few years. Well, first, I think the multidisciplinary research required to innovate in food tech exists in Israel. And as you can see on the top left, we have over 300 relevant research labs across Israel, from the Technion and Tel Hai in the north to Tel Aviv University and the Hebrew University in central Israel, and more. And about 30 of them are already active in our field. Second, Israel is known as startup nation. And as you can see on the bottom left, this is true also for alternative protein. Israel is second in the world in the amount of fermentation and cultivated meat startups, and we obviously have a lot of plant-based startups as well. Third, if you look at the top right, the Israeli alternative protein ecosystem has a lot of access to capital. And in fact, alternative protein is the fastest growing field in Israel in terms of investment in the past couple of years. And last but not least, on the bottom right, you can see Prime Minister Netanyahu, former Prime Minister Netanyahu, tasting cultivated meat, becoming the first head of government worldwide to taste it. And this demonstrates some of the government support this field has in Israel. And together with a lot of partners, we are promoting a national policy plan to advance the field. More about that in a few minutes. And let's go now to Aviv, who will share with us the insights from the Israeli State of Innovation report. Aviv.
Thank you very much, Nir, and hello, everybody. So in the industry sessions, I would like to cover with you guys today the investments in alternative proteins company in Israel. We will cover the startups that are active in this space, and also some of the market data that we collected during 2020. Let's start with the review of all the startups that are active in the alternative protein ecosystem in Israel. We have more than 100 over 100 companies that are active in the alternative protein ecosystem. Among them, about 40% are startup companies with breakthrough technologies. And we can say that we have about 30 plus early stage startups in the pipeline, what we refer to as venture creation activity in the alternative protein ecosystem. In this slide, you can see that we are dividing the startups under the technology sectors of cultivated meat or dairy, fermentation, and plant-based. We also divided the startups into the growth stage of a company under the seed, development, pilot and scan, and commercializations and grow. You can see that the plant-based startups, we have more of them already in the commercial stage, already selling products in the market. And in fermentation and cultivated meat, we can see that most of the startups are between the seed stage to the pilot and scale-up stage. And let's dive into the different categories. Under the cultivated meat companies, we have 5 startups that are active in Israel, 4 of them in the meat sectors and 1 of them in the dairy sector, biomilk. We have Aleph Farm, which up until a few weeks ago raised $120 million. They are a private company with strategic investors such as Cargill, BRF, with also partnerships deals with Mitsubishi for the APAC market. Aleph is working on a whole cut beefsteak using their unique scaffolding technique. We have Future Meat that is mostly work on fat cells for beef, chicken, and lamb. Future Meat have raised so far $43 million, private company with strategic partnership as Tyson, Muller, ADM. Supermeat working on cultivated kitchen. Meatech, which is also traded on the Tel Aviv Stock Exchange and on NASDAQ, has raised so far from the public market $36 million, and they are working on beef with a unique technology of 3D printed in order to create the all-cut stack. And we have BioMilk also traded on the Tel Aviv Stock Exchange that is working on cultivated dairy. Under the fermentations company, as Nir mentioned, Israel is also second in the world, second to the US in the absolute number of fermentation startups under the alternative protein ecosystem. We have Remilk and Imaginary under the category of precision fermentation, working to produce dairy protein from yeast or from bacteria. Both Remilk and Imaginary already successfully raised their seed and on the way for a successful A round. We have biomass fermentation companies such as Chunk and Kinoko. Chunk is working on whole cut solid state fermentation with plant-based technologies. We have Brevel working on microalgae, the Mediterranean Food Lab, trying to develop solution and ingredients for flavoring, and IP that is working on yeast-based single-celled protein. In the plant-based categories, plant-based meat category, we have Redefined Meat that's just launching their product to the food service market in Israel. You can find their burgers and their meats. Redefined is a plant-based meat analog company with also a unique technology for 3D printed for whole cut stack. We have Savorit under the plant-based and Wonders. We have early stage startups, including Alfred's, that have a novel technology in order to produce a unique texturized meat analog platform. We have Plantish, an early stage company working on a scalable technology for plant-based seafood products. Additional company including Real Bite, Meet the End, and More Food. Under the plant-based dairy and eggs company, we have ingredients companies such as Chickpea and InnovaPro. Chickpea is developing a 90% isolate chickpea plant protein isolate, and they are about to launch the product on the commercial scale to the US and to APAC market. We have InnovaPro that are already selling the product, and they are working on concentrate, protein concentrate that it's 70% chickpea. InnovaPro raised so far $18 million, and during 2020 began their commercializations and scale up. Under the plant-based egg, we have Zero Egg that is about to launch the product to the food service market in the US. And we have Yo, a rising startup that has an amazing product of plant-based sunny side up egg. And they are aiming to launch the product in Israel and preparing for penetration in the UK market. Under the plant-based dairy, we have YoFix that is producing a clean label, salt-free fermented yogurt. And we have Else that are already traded on the Toronto Stock Exchange, and they are producing a plant-based formula for infants. Israel has many programs for early stage companies. The leading ones are the two incubators that are supported by the Israeli Innovation Authority, the Kitchen Food Tech Hub by Strauss Group, with multinational partners such as PepsiCo, Mondelez, Givaudan, and Danone. Startups that are entering the Kitchen Hub receiving between $650,000 to $1 million investments. And they are entering a program of 1 to 2 years program in order to accelerate them for a later stage growth. Fresh Start is an incubator in the north of Israel by Tnuva, the largest food company in Israel, in partnership with Tempo, Finisterre, and Our Crowd. And they are receiving, companies that are entering this incubator is receiving about almost $1 million of investments, usually a 2 years program. Additional programs include eNegev in the south, Trade Lines in the north, IFF that is just launching a new IFF with their innovation lab, and ICL that just launched a new accelerator for plant-based. Let's talk about the investments in the alternative protein ecosystem, and then we will dive into the Israeli ecosystem. So global figures of 2020, we see a major increase in the investments in alternative protein companies. If 2019 was about $1 billion of venture capital investments, we see that it doubled in 2020 to 3.1 billion. Most of the investments went to plant-based companies, obviously, because they are most of them are already in the commercializations stage, but we see a big increase in fermentation and in cultivated investments as well. When we talk about the Israeli ecosystem, so we see that Israel is a leading country in terms of R&D investments per capita. And in terms of R&D, in terms of VC investments per capita. If we look at the alternative protein ecosystem, it's the fastest growing tech industry in Israel. We analyzed the average of investments in the last 3 years, and we see that the average growth of investments in alternative protein is 187. If we compare this to the leading tech industries in Israel, such as cybersecurity or fintech, we can see that it's cyber is about 50%, fintech is about 38% of growth in the last 3 years. However, the amount of investments is still in the early stage. In 2020, alternative proteins startups in Israel raised $114 million, far behind sectors like, for example, the fintech, that those startups raised 1.7 billion in Israel only in 2020. So our projection that in 2021, we will see a major growth in the investments of alternative protein company. Most likely we will get closer to $500 million investments in the alternative protein ecosystem. If we analyze it by sector or by year, so you can see a major increase between 2019 to 2020 in the amount of investments in alternative protein companies. And same as the global numbers, we can see that most of the capital went to plant-based companies. Just to give you a reference for the biggest round around the world. So under the plant-based category, we have Impossible Food with Series F of $500 million. Under the fermentation, we have Perfect Day with $300 million Series C. And under the cultivated section, Memphis Meats with Upside Food today with $186 million Series B. The biggest deal in Israel in 2020 belongs to Else Nutrition, which is a public company. We actually monitor also investments or capital raised from public companies as well, because those companies are in the early stages and we do not consider those as exits, but as money that will come to support the company's strategic plan for investments in R&D and growth. So Else Nutrition raised so far $45 million, $30 million of them in 2020. Those numbers are representing the summary of 2020, but during 2021, we see big ones coming from some of the companies that are active here. Let's discuss a few of them. Under the cultivated section, we have Future Meat, that has raised in early 2021 26.7 million in post-Series A round in order to support the growth of producing local manufacturing and scale up. FutureMeat also signed a major deal with Nestle in order to partner with them to produce plant-based and cultivated meat products. We have other farm that several months ago announced a big round of 105 million Series B. And under the plant-based categories, we have Redefined Meat that raised in early 2021, 29 million in Series A for them to scale up and to reach to the market. And we have Equinom. Equinom is working on a novel breeding approach to improve seeds and to deliver high quality sources of ingredients for the plant-based industry. And they raised in Series D several months ago, $20 million. If we are going to analyze the trends in investments in Israel between 2018 to 2020, so we see that in 2018, most of the capital came from VCs. However, we see corporate and incubators are also a big chunk of the capital that was raised by companies. And during 2020, we can see that that companies raise money from the stock market are a big chunk of the capital that came to those companies, if it was from the Nasdaq or from Tel Aviv Stock Exchange. And venture capital, the percentage of venture capital money decreases to 38%, which is an interesting trend to keep on and monitor. Some of the IPOs under the category of alternative protein companies in the Tel Aviv Stock Exchange, we have Savorit with their 3D plant-based meat. We have BioMilk, NextFirm, and MeatTech. We also have R&D partnerships publicly traded in Tel Aviv Stock Exchange, and those R&D partnerships are actually investing in alternative protein or food tech companies. We have MeatTech that completed their IPO in the Nasdaq, and we have ELSE that is traded on the Toronto Stock Exchange. Leading investors in Israeli startups are coming from Israeli investors and also from international investors, almost half-half, actually with a small advantage to the international investors, 60% are international investors and 40% are Israeli investors. The leading investors on the Israeli sectors are the incubators and the Israeli Innovation Authority that is providing seed funding for those early stage startups in order to reduce the risk from private investors. And with Unovis, EIT Food, CPT Capitals as entities and venture capitals that are leading from the international sector. The last part of the industry, I will want to cover the market opportunities and some of the market data that is coming from the Israeli market. So with the projection and the market focus for the meat industry only, we see that it's projected to be between 10% to 23% of the total meat market. Plant-based and cultivated meat, depending which data source you are looking at. And we already are familiar with the fact that this trend is being led mostly by not only vegan and vegetarian, but also by the market of the flexitarians. And when we analyze the 2019 versus 2020 retail data in Israel, so we see that the plant-based product increases in sale 13 times more than the animal-based product. When we dive into the categories or to the market size first, so we see that in 2018, the Israel market size of plant-based product was 153 million, and in 2020, almost $220 million. If we compare the different categories, we can see in yellow the animal-based products and in green the plant-based product. So we can see the growth compared to 2020 to 2019. So we see the animal-based product grew in 11%, 8%, 6%, 8%. Take into account that during COVID, the consumptions of our in-house food increases. So we actually see maybe even a reduction in the milk consumption. And in the plant-based category, we see 58% increase for the meat product, 36% increase for the milk, yogurt, and cream. When we compare the same type of analysis to the US market, so what we can see is a very similar trends between the markets, which is very encouraging in the way that those products will be adopted in small market versus a big market in the Western world. So we see that, for example, under the meat, 72% increase versus 24%, and milk 27% increase versus 9%, very similar to the Israeli market data. When we take the analog product, the analog meat product versus the non-analog product in the US market, so we see that the biggest market share in the US is for the analog products. Those are the products that may be more appealing to the flexitarian market and therefore to the big market. And when we analyze in the US market the percentage of plant-based milk out of the total milk market, we can see it's 15%. That means that in the US market, plant-based milk is almost in every third house. When we try to analyze the potential for the plant-based meat, so at the moment, it's 1.4% of the total meat market in the US. That's mean if the plant-based meat will reach the same market percentage as milk, it's a 14 billion opportunity only in the US market. When we do the same exercise to the Israeli market, we see again, very similar data. We see that the plant-based milk market in Israel is 13% out of the total milk market during 2020. And that the plant-based meat is 3%, which represent a 1.3 billion opportunity only in the plant-based meat market for the Israel retail market. I would like to pass it back to Nir to talk about some of the science and technology in the academia in Israel and also to the policy section. Thank you very much, everybody.
Thanks, Aviv. This was fascinating and very insightful. Let's dive into the SciTech field very briefly. And if you skip to the next slide, we will be able to see the different research labs gathered around Israel, as I mentioned at the beginning, interested in this field. So in yellow, you can see the number of academic labs interested that are currently active in alternative protein research around the country. All around the country, we actually have over 30 of them now, and about 40% of those are currently receiving financing from GFI. In addition, we have mapped all of the research labs around the country who are interested or are able to contribute to the research field of alternative protein around the country, and we now know of more than 300 labs that are relevant in the country to contribute to alternative protein. And to give you a few more specific examples, if we skip to this slide, we will see that in the fields of plant-based research, we have researchers such as Dr. Ophir Benjamin, who is doing quinoa research in Tel Hai College, Dr. Yoav Livni, who is researching algae in the Technion in Northern Israel, and Dr. Oded Josayov, who is working on a variety of very interesting fields, including what later on became Favorite, a company which is currently traded in the Tel Aviv Stock Exchange market. We only have 2 research labs currently active in fermentation, and one of them is even a co-founder of Imaginary, fermentation for milk alternative startup. And in the fields of cultivated meat, we have a variety of research labs active in the field, from Professor Yaakov Nachmias in the Hebrew University, who is the founder of Future Meat Technologies, to Dr. Iftach Nachman in Tel Aviv University, who has research in the fields of suspension-based muscle mass, and Professor Marcel Machlouf in the Technion, who is also a GFI grantee and has recently announced she is opening the first startup based on a GFI grant here in Israel. Moving on to policy, we will give you a very brief introduction to what we do here around our national policy plan with alternative proteins, which we have had the honor to present to multiple Israeli ministries and is currently advancing. We have identified, together with the ecosystem, 3 main obstacles in the path of alternative protein in Israel to really flourish. The first is academic research, both basic and applied. We are lacking both infrastructure and funding for academic research. And you saw that we have some, but obviously it's not enough for the magnitude of change and scale that we want to see. The second obstacle here in Israel is the transition from applied research in the academic world or in early stage startups to scale up and industrial manufacturing. We are seeing a lot of Israeli early stage startups that have to move overseas because they are lacking the infrastructure to do scale up manufacturing here in Israel. This is something we hope to help ease for these startups using local scale-up facilities. And the third, and a very common struggle for startups here, as well as everywhere else in the world, is the field of regulatory approval, mostly of novel food and ingredients, such as cultivated meat, sometimes fermented based foods, but also other types of local regulation issues. All of those 3 are issues that we are currently working on with the Israeli government. And we will begin to wrap up by letting you know that all of our resources are available on our website, gfi.org.il. We have our innovation report at length. You have databases of all of the Israeli startups and relevant research labs, a startup manual, a career board, and more and more. And that's about it. I would like to thank very much Aviv Oren for conducting the research for this report and for leading today's webinar, and thank you for joining us.